Hi everyone, welcome to the latest video for YA ThrillerCon. I'm joined this afternoon by Matt Killeen, and we're going to be talking about Orphan Monster Spy, which is this amazing thriller. I'm currently reading it and I'm really enjoying it, and just like, I can't read it fast enough and I keep having to pace myself because I don't like reading everything like really quickly because I just feel that I'm not sort of like getting everything from it. So yeah, I'm just sort of like reading a couple chapters each evening at the moment. And yeah, when I was setting up YA ThrillerCon, I was looking for authors that I could interview to find out more about their books, their writing processes, where they get inspiration from. And yeah, I was delighted to be able to interview Matt about his writing. So firstly, we'll start with like introductions. As I said, I'm Madeline Dyer. I write YA dystopians and YA thrillers. So yeah, Matt, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name is Matt Killeen. I am the author of Orphan Monster Spy and Devil Darling Spy, and very pleased to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here. So yeah, for viewers who don't know about your books, can you tell us a little bit about what Orphan Monster Spy is about?
Yes, Orphan Monster Spy is the story of a Jewish German girl who is orphaned in an escape attempt at the beginning of the Second World War. She runs into a British agent, she saves him, and then goes to work for him undercover in a school for the daughters of elite Nazis in order to access a reclusive nuclear scientist. And and it's quite gritty and dark, but at the same time, it's a thriller. So it sort of goes with some pace. There's a big explosion at the end because nothing closes the narrative like a big explosion. Devil Darling Spy is the continuation. It's a sequel. Sarah, by this point, is a sort of the darling of the Shirley Temple of German high society in Berlin, and they hold these big parties where generals and industrialists come, and they're recording everything. And there they get sort of contacted by Admiral Canaris, who was a real person. He was the head of the German Abwehr, the military intelligence, whose allegiances are very, historically very questionable. And there's a lot of people who say that he was really working for British intelligence, but I think that's an exaggeration. But anyway, I have him send them on a mission to sort of sub-Saharan Africa in search of a scientist doing bioweapons research on the population. And it's sort of discusses sort of imperialism and colonialism, and it's a bit of an eye-opener. It was an eye-opener writing it, so I hope it's the same for most other people.
Yeah, like I was intrigued actually when I found out that you'd written a sequel, because like from my experience with reading YA thrillers, it's quite unusual to have like a sequel with the same characters. I know I was talking to Callie Taylor about this one time recently, and I saw her at a crime reading as well in Exeter, and she was saying that it's quite unusual to have a sequel concerning the same characters because you've already put them through quite a lot in one book. And yeah, so when you were writing Orphan Monster Spy, did you know at that point that you would be writing a sequel, or did that sort of come about later?
Well, in my head, there was this whole story about Sarah, and there would be, one story for each year of the war, with sort of an overarching character development. And, I told my agent this, and she said, "Great, but never tell anybody that. No one will sign it if they think there's 7 books. Don't be ridiculous. Just shh." And I had a reasonably clear idea what the second, well, actually had a much clearer idea what book 3 and 4 and 5 were going to be. 2 was a bit questionable, but it looked like they would buy 2 books off me, so I had to then get that very clear in my head how that was going to work. This was kind of in the aftermath of publishers signing a lot of trilogies and then really regretting it by the time the 3rd book comes out, when nobody has bought them and they have to like publish push out a book that that few people really wanted. So yeah, so two books, and I think they're nice companion pieces. I think they are very different to each other. It's been remarked, a few people have said, gosh, it's a very different book from the first one. But I think in my head, Sarah is a sort of living, breathing person, and so she has this kind of journey, and I personally know where she will eventually end up. So it seems very natural that there is more to it. So we'll see. It might just be 2 books.
Okay.
We'll see how it goes. And one of the things about publishing is, like, in the end, these things are very rarely up to the author. You know, they will go, please write me books 3, 4, and 5, or nothing at all, and you really don't have, you know, a lot of choice. But the stories are there, and they're in my head, and every so often my editor would like put in a little note going, oh my goodness, is this and this, and says, well, that saves us a conversation like book 5. But yeah, yeah. Who knows?
Have you got a book to hold up to the camera just so like viewers can see?
Well, this is Orphan Monster Spy. It's got beautiful gold foil on it. This was designed by Will Steele, who works at Usborne very often. And the companion is Devil Darling Spy, which has this beautiful red foil. Really, really nice. Yeah. So these are the 2 books, and they look really nice next to each other. I mean, I think it is, you know, one of the great moments of my life when I saw, you know, these books arriving, because yeah, after all those years of work, to actually have them arrive and look at them was just amazing. In the US, they're they've gone for a very different style. This is the paperback version of Orphan Monster Spy, and do I have a copy of Devil Darling Spy? Sorry, this is very unprofessional. This is the US Devil Darling Spy. And it's very interesting seeing, I think Kristen Boyle does the designs for these. It's very interesting seeing how different markets sell different things in different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, they're very different design.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do think I like the editions better, to be honest.
I don't discriminate. I'm not allowed to discriminate.
I don't know. I just love covers with like foil on and like shiny, and especially like ones where like the light will catch off it as well, and it just like draws more attention to it. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. I'm very fond of covers like that, and covers that have like embossing on as well. I really like texture.
Oh yes, yeah. And a little bit of foil. There's lots of not foil, UV. Like the pattern here catches the light depending on the. It's just excellent. I do want sprayed edges. That's they'll probably be out of fashion by the time my next book comes out. But like that's just seems really exciting to me. Somebody was saying the other day, are there separate hobbies, reading and collecting books? I buy a lot of books. I don't read as much as I should. So you know, sprayed edges a little more important to me than they should be, I think.
So yeah, what draws you to the YA thriller genre then?
Well, I don't know that I go, right, I need to read a thriller or write a thriller. There are various genres that I'm into that have, you know, thick thriller elements. I think I do read and enjoy books that do not have thriller elements, but there is nothing more compelling than, you know, danger, tension, going on that journey with the characters and not knowing something and then something being revealed, or like I mean, there's nothing. I love a twist. I'm constantly disappointed by twists because there's something in my brain going, oh, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this. So it's not necessarily that I see a twist coming. It's just when the twist comes, I go, well, I considered that was a possibility. And yeah, I'm a spoil sport. I did like film at university, and that, you know, almost ruined films for me, because like you're constantly taking things apart and, you know, spotting foreshadowing and you know, Chekhov's gun early on, and you go, well, that's coming up later, and like the further it goes into the film where it hasn't come up again, like you know, you're just waiting for it. And yeah, so there was actually, I had a friend who, this is a rubbish story, by the way, because in order to tell it, I have to then ruin a twist, and I'm not going to. But somebody said, "Oh yeah, so and so film. Oh, that's got a twist." And I go, "Don't tell me." And he goes, "Okay, I won't tell you about that, but I'll tell you about this Twilight Zone episode I once saw." And then I was halfway through watching the film, and I went, "Oh, he told me." You know, it's like when you say, "Don't tell me what the score was, I've got it recorded," and somebody goes, "Oh, well, I won't tell you, but it wasn't 0-0," and then you realize they've ruined the game halfway through. So yeah, I do, as a writer of historical fiction, you know, the history is very important to me. I'm usually recounting some detail. I'm talking about the Holocaust, or I'm talking about, you know, bioweapons research during the Second World War, or I'm talking about colonialism. And I think it is important, if you are going to do that, that you have a delivery system for this information. Wasn't it Lord Macaulay said, you know, history needs to be burnt into the imagination before it can be realized by the reason, or something. You know, I think you need a good story in order to do that, and it's a careful balance, because if you are talking about something like the Holocaust, you need to make sure it's not prurient, that it's not tasteless. But if the story is not an exciting one, then people won't go, "Oh my God, I read this book and it's brilliant, and you've got to, and tell me when you get to this bit." And, you know, that is important. I used to be a musician, and I was very, you know, I had no problem with it being a commercial art. You know, if people didn't want to listen to it, if they didn't want to dance to it, then, you know, you were to some degree wasting your time. You know, if you had something to say, the more people who could hear it, the better. You know, Shakespeare was, I'm quoting Julian Cope here, but he said Shakespeare was a bums on seats man. You know, he wanted, you know, Tudor sycophant maybe, but he wanted people on his seats so that they could hear his art. So yeah, yeah. So I mean, you know, the thriller, the tension is incredibly valuable to the art of storytelling. Yeah,
definitely. I know one of the things one of the things that really brings me to the YA thriller genre is the feeling of like being scared, but being scared like in a controlled way, where like I'm like choosing to be scared, and it's being able to feel that fear, but also knowing that you're safe as well. And it's the anticipation of feeling that fear and being scared that really, it just makes me want to read thrillers all the time, basically. So yeah.
It's I have a 5-year-old now. I was about to say 4-year-old, 5-year-old now, who I have a lot of toys, and, you know, I have a lot of monsters. Like, I'm very much into the Alien, and so he's interested. Like, he's really into Godzilla, because I like Godzilla and, you know, plasticky Japanese movies. And but like he hits a point where something gets scary, and he's at the point where he's now wants to know why do we want scary things. And you know, it has made me think very deeply about that. I think it's that we need to experience these things in a controlled manner. We are very rarely worried about monsters. We are worried about a range of human issues that the monsters represent, and we like to be, I think we like to, in an intellectual space, experience the fight or flight thing, because that's actually very exciting. We tend to like that. And I think with thrillers though as well, when you're talking about creating tension, you are you know something the characters do not.
Mm-hmm.
And like in Orphan Monster Spy, Sarah knows that Jews are being treated appallingly. She does not know where this is going to lead. You know, there's a moment where she goes, you know, what, they'd put us all in a camp? Where would they put all of us? Because it's just such an inconceivable concept.
Yeah.
The captain kind of plays this role as slightly omniscient, knows where everything is going, because he's got all the information. But we kind of know where being a Jew in Germany can lead. So we are frightened on her behalf.
Yeah.
She is not necessarily carrying all that with her. And, you know, she gets to the school and, you know, I introduce the Ice Queen and I show her bullying up front, and then she doesn't experience any further bullying by the Ice Queen. And, you know, for most of the book, because I've shown you what can happen, and then I've sort of dangled that fear, you know, and that's something that you and the character both understand. But then when you get towards the end of the book, and then, you know, here we are in spoiler territory, there are things that will be revealed, and when you look back you go, oh, I knew that. And how far have you got in the book? Because I don't want to spoil it for you.
I'm about a third of the way.
Okay. There is a moment where all is revealed,
Mm-hmm.
and then she, because she is drunk, she forgets.
Okay.
So you may have spotted what's happening because there are clues all the way through. Then it is all revealed to you, and then the character forgets, and you know. And so there's like a series of different experiences that work with that. It does get very intense. It's very dark. It's not so much there are moments that it's not fun. It's just horror. And I think that's another sort of aspect of the thriller thing, is there comes a point where it pushes you into horror, you know, when you are, you know, just terrified on behalf of the people. I think somebody said that the end of Orphan Monster Spy gave them the cold sweats.
Okay.
And yeah, and certainly I did not enjoy writing the end. Like I got to that point, and you know, if you are doing writing properly, you are in a state of empathy, and therefore you have to be in the head of all the different characters to a certain extent. And you know, there are people in Orphan Monster Spy who are just appalling humans, and being in their head is a deeply uncomfortable, horrible place to be. So
very draining. And
yeah.
So what was your actual writing process like when you first decided to start writing this book?
I had in the past, because I had a career in sort of copywriting and advertising, and before that, like sort of the academic period, I did a lot of exams, and with those, you know, deadlines, you've got 3 hours until the end of the exam, or I need this by 5 o'clock, and you can't spend time just staring off into space. You just have to start writing. And so a lot of my writing process prior to that was like piecing together bits that I had written, whereas Orphan Monster Spy was the first time I had a very clear idea what the beginning was, how it was going to start. I knew how it was going to end, and I had like a couple of tentpole moments in between. And so because I was doing an MA at MMU in creative writing, and this was my dissertation project essentially. And so I started writing it as one of the exercises, 2,000 words, action, scene. And that was like the beginning of Orphan Monster Spy, which hasn't changed a great deal over time. And so then I just kept writing like chronologically, and because what I discovered was happening was things were happening that I had not expected, that were just coming out of my fingers. The characters were saying things that I didn't necessarily consciously process. Sarah basically tells me what I know there are writers who hate this and think that this is cheating or stupid, but my characters talk to me and they tell me what to write. It comes out of my head. Now, I'm not crazy. It's just, that's the way my subconscious, my creativity has kind of processed itself. I do. Yeah. And sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, and you know that cusp between dreaming and awake when you're in the room but stuff is happening, and like that's a moment where Sarah is sitting on the end of the bed going, this is what's going to happen next, get up and write it, get up and write it now. And I'm like, no, leave me alone, it's 3 a.m. or I'm in the shower, get out. And yeah, so they, particularly the captain and Sarah, very early on, I wasn't entirely sure what their relationship was going to be, but they told me, they interacted, they did it. And by virtue of writing chronologically, I was able to let those things develop naturally. You know, she was lying on a rooftop and she was going to be woken up by something, and then for some reason airships came into my head, and then I went, well, okay, where would there be an airship? And then, well, then this port is Friedrichshafen. This is in fact, you know, Lake Constance, and you know, it all came together. You know, the research, there's an element of research first, and then there's kind of research that happens along the way to make sure you're being correct, but there's also stuff where you go, I wonder if, and then you look, and then there's this thing, and then you go, brilliant, and then it all just fits together very scientifically. Yeah, so I kind of went through and I wrote the first third, and that went swimmingly, 20,000 words, bang, 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 bang. And then I knew that the end was going to be 20,000 words, bang, 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 bang. And then I went to the middle bit with the school, and that was just like, whoa, huge, 50,000 words. And I had to cut loads, and it needed extra stuff. And the, I handed in, you know, perfectly good manuscript for my MA, but I knew that there were problems with it. And it took me about 6 months of having a nervous breakdown over it, and then like another year kind of figuring out what was wrong, writing the extra bits and doing the editing. My agent Molly is a brilliant editor and a real hard ass, and she she broke me, and like I owe a lot to that process, because she was like going, I need to know who's thinking this, why are they having this emotion, tell me how they're feeling. And I'm going, well, he's a sociopath, she's probably autistic, nobody's thinking and feeling anything. But she was right about pretty much everything. Yeah, so yeah, and then the sequel was painful because I kind of, you know, what an idiot I was deciding I was going to set it in Africa, because I thought, oh, you know, it's just a question of research. But you know, colonial thinking being what it is, there's so little written about Africa, so little written about, you know, francophone Africa that isn't in French. And you know, despite my I fake it very well, I'm appalling at languages, and you know, trying to find that information and make sure that it was right, and make sure that I wasn't creating something tasteless and racist was the fear was very intense, and it took me a long time to get that together. But in the end, I kind of wrote pretty much all of it in 45 days, because I missed the first deadline. And the whole publication got pushed back a year, and this was like a disaster for so many reasons. And I realized I was going to miss the next deadline, and I had 45 working days left. So that was it. I didn't leave until I finished my 1,852 words every day. I didn't leave the computer. And so that was like, oof, very quick. But, you know, being a writer isn't just writing. Writing is a huge amount of it, because if it's not written, it's not there. But there's a lot of soul searching and beating yourself up and crying into your breakfast cereal that goes on. That's a part of the process.
Yeah, definitely. Like you've mentioned some of the research that you had to do. Were you surprised by the amount of research that you needed to do in order to write these books?
I I grew up in the kind of the war mad late 70s, early 80s, and so I knew a lot about the Second World War. So there was like a foundation stone upon which everything else was built. And I have a particular fascination with it because I grew up in this war mad time where all the comics, all the stories, all the films, everything was Dambusters and Victor, and true stories of the VC heroes, and with very, very stereotypical two-dimensional Germans. But my mum's best friend was German, and so our families were linked, and we spent spent wonderful, happy, blissful summers in Germany. Wonderful, beautiful place, lovely, friendly people who were like rabidly pacifist, who wouldn't let me play. Couldn't play Star Wars. In 1979, 1980, that was a big deal, not being allowed to play Star Wars, because it was too violent, without a talking to about where violence leads. And there was a dichotomy there because of the two peoples. Clearly, we were the war mad ones, and how I didn't understand how that could be. And so as I got older and I knew more about the Third Reich and more about the Holocaust, that tension just became, basically set up a lifetime's horrified fascination to know why that happened, how that could happen, how these people could do this. And so I had a kind of foundation stone for this whole thing. Orphan Monster Spy was easier in that respect, since it was talking about Germany, it was talking about the beginning of the Second World War, it was talking about spies, special operations, it was talking about nuclear physics, which, again, I grew up in the early 80s and, nearly all died in 1983. And, I have a sort of dark fascination with scary things. And, nuclear war was a sort of a constant. And I thought that actually the more I knew, that would make it less frightening, and that's not actually the case. It's much better not to think about nuclear war at all, because the reality is just so appalling. So that made Orphan Monster Spy easier. I knew, for example, I wanted to put Lisa Meitner in it because, I found out about Lisa Meitner and I was like, why is she not talked about in schools? But Devil Darling Spy was a different order of research required. I knew a lot about disease because, again, childhood fascination. We used to, because we went to Germany, we went to the continent a lot. There were the terrifying rabies posters. I was a lot more worried about, isn't it like quicksand and rabies, two things that didn't actually turn out to be as important in life as we were led to believe. And disease, I was always fascinated by that. I think it was because the last cases of smallpox ever were at Birmingham University, and I grew up in Birmingham, and that woman died in East Birmingham Hospital, just down the road from where I lived. And I think, if you are a very curious type person, that happening, I absorbed all that. So there was that stuff was easier to process, but African history, the French in Africa, imperialism, colonialism, this is stuff that just isn't, it's not taught in schools. It's very hard to have a basis of that, a foundation of that without specifically looking for it. I think this is all, the last 6 months, all of this has come to a head. We know now, how little we know about imperialism, when all of a sudden, they're pulling down the statue in Bristol, and people are going, well, why are they pulling down the statue? And they go, what? We have statues to people who responsible for thousands of deaths. Why are we doing that? And that just seems self-evident. And yeah, so that was just much harder. The stuff on the Devil Darling Spy is in part inspired by Unit 731, which was just a war crime of massive proportions committed by the Japanese in Manchuria, and the research for that was quite hard, because that was, I don't know, I had spent a lot of, I was kind of familiar with the Holocaust from a very early age. To hear what Unit 731 did in so many words is just, it's the kind of thing that makes you want to curl up and start crying. Yeah, so the genesis of Devil Darling Spy was a book, I have it here, The Kaiser's Holocaust, David Olusoga book, Caspar Eriksson, about the Nama and Herero genocides committed by the German Empire. And they, I heard this and I said, well, that sounds very much like the Holocaust to me, and so it proved. But reading it it kind of pushed me over the edge. I read bits of it and then just came out like ranting, like, oh my God, that this happened, and all the other European countries went, and that was the extent of it, that this could happen, and there was not a massive outcry. Just filled me with rage. And then it was the realization off the back of that, and like then going back to what I knew about the Belgians in the Congo Free State, that these were extreme examples of things that European powers had been doing in Africa, in South America for centuries. And just the level of horror, and how that notion that some people are just not as important as other people is the heart of everything that goes wrong in the world. And it's also at the heart of the Holocaust. It's at the heart of the Second World War. And it makes the moral complexity of the Second World War is thick. Because, was Britain standing up against the Nazis specifically, or, was it worried about, India, or about Suez Canal, about maintaining that empire? And, it makes the kind of celebrations for VE Day seem very tasteless to me, because we did terrible things in order to win that war. We just happen to not talk about those very much. We interfered with countries' self-determination. We carpet bombed civilians, and and you could argue all of these things were necessary in the big picture, but you cannot pretend that the Second World War is this great moral crusade, because it is just so much messier than that. And all that kind of permeates Devil Darling Spy. Is the point, Sarah is saying, how do we do this? How do we fight this when, in order to win, we have to do terrible, terrible things? And I think if you're not thinking that, if you aren't questioning Britain's or the United States' place in the world in terms of, past colonialism and past crimes, you are just not accepting history for what it really is. And I think we all need to take responsibility for that.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry, did that answer your question? Because that was just me. I told you I was just going to, once I got talking.
Well, a lot of lead naturally into that, important to talk about anyway. So it's hard to talk about like one specific thing in isolation anyway. So yeah, what are you currently working on now?
Well, I'm in a kind of limbo purgatory right now, where I am preparing a number of things. On the one hand, I have there's a story about combat medics in the Soviet Union who were predominantly female, and they weren't non-combatants, so they had to fight. They were shot at. They usually carried weapons because they had to defend themselves, would crawl onto the battlefield and treat people in the middle of firefights. If they were captured, they were probably going to be murdered. the Eastern Front, the war was, terrible. And so story about them and Stalingrad and, the snipers. There were a lot of female snipers. So sort of very female story. It's kind of inspired by the work of the uncommonly face of the unwomanly face of war. Yes, sorry. There's Alexeyevich's wonderful oral histories, because if you just, all the history, all the emotional resonance that you need in order to tell this story is there in those books. So there's that. I'm currently I'm working on chapters for a story about essentially the Nazi movement in the US before the start of the war. There were the German-American Bund, which was essentially a sort of Nazi operation, and were holding huge rallies in Madison Square Garden of tens of thousands of people, and they had summer camps where children went to learn how to be good Nazis and stormtroopers, and so it's going to be story about that. I think ties quite neatly into the Orphan Monster Spy universe. I think.
Yeah, I think that.
Yeah. So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Okay, so where do you get your inspiration from? Like, are there any specific things that you go to when you're sort of like thinking about a new book idea?
Ooh, I think when I give the school talk, the way I wrap up all the kind of the random inspiration stuff is that you never know. I did not get into learning about the Second World War and the Third Reich and the Holocaust as a child because I thought one day I'm going to write a book about this. I think you have to kind of go with where your interests lie. And so if you are, I have a dog, and so the exercise is mandated. I have to go off and into the woods, and sometimes I just listen to the ambient music and think about whatever plot problem I have. But sometimes it's just like podcasts and stories and just like random stuff that the Memory Palace and Radio Lab are both very good, because they both have like that. Memory Palace is more history, but it's just those little slivers of information. And I heard a podcast about about Tunnel 29 in East Germany. And I kind of went with that, and I listened to it, and I've listened to a book about it. I listen to a lot of stuff because it's when I'm walking. And then I read Stasiland by Anna Funder, and all of a sudden, like, taking on the information about East Germany now, because I knew Germans, I knew about East Germany. I don't think I ever got the level of horror connected with the Stasi. And yeah, so I have become fascinated with that, and so I have a story bubbling around in my head. I shouldn't have a story bubbling about it. I should be concentrating on one of the other projects, but you just can't. I have to let it happen.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's where the inspiration comes. I learnt about Unit 731. I can't remember exactly where I heard about it for the first time, but I was just so horrified, and I was going, I have to tell people about this. People need to know. People need to have this they need to have this understanding of the world and what had happened, and of history, about the fact that very few people ever paid for the crimes because they were captured by the Americans and went to work in Fort Detrick and where they were still doing human experiments in up to the 1970s. And I didn't have a place for that. I didn't know how Sarah was ever going to get to Manchuria, and quite a lot of it was already happening when Sarah was running around Friedrichshafen trying to get to Switzerland. And but you just you have to go with it, and it will surface at the right moment. Yeah. And then I watch a lot of my wife always like, why are you watching that documentary again? It's going to make you cry. You're going to be in a bad mood. If you do that, what you are looking for are just those moments where somebody will say something that maybe you haven't noticed before that has an emotional resonance to it. It's usually people. Oral histories are brilliant at this. Oral histories, people's talking that just trigger something in your brain, and then you have to just let your brain do it, go with it. I mean, I think Second World War is particularly interesting right now when you're talking about Nazis and stuff, because those people are beginning to die off now. So there are a lot of older people who are willing to say what they actually thought at the time, or what they do actually think, who have not felt they could all this time, and people who think that they can now admit things because they're too old to pay for them. And so there's a lot of stuff emerging that is terrifying. But it's so much more real when it's coming out, when it's in someone's words.
Yeah,
you know?
definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, like, especially you can sort of feel the emotion as well. It's all about making it like a personal experience as well.
Yeah, I use that word a lot when I'm talking about it. Emotional authenticity is you can describe something in great detail, but it's not going to come to life unless you can put your finger on a thing that will make people understand it as a human. And that is often what I'm looking for. You can't really fake that. It has to be something that you have spotted and you have taken, right, I need to take this and put it in that manuscript, and that will make people understand it better. If that makes sense.
It does, yeah, because it's all about like the connection and, like you say, like being authentic about it, and like the emotion as well, and it's got to be organic and natural, because like you were saying, you can't like fake that, because it's so raw and so real, but it's got to be like organic when it's there.
Yeah.
So what are your favorite YA thrillers and mysteries?
Well, I think when people talk about YA thrillers, they very often mean like it's a book about lying and a bunch of kids and somebody did something. And I don't read as many of them as, I mean, to be honest, I don't read as much as I should, because I have a lot of research to get through, and I tend to read what I buy at launches and stuff. So I ended up siloing myself. In that kind of genre, though, I love Sue Woolman's books. I think they're really good. And Dana Melee, People Like Us. Again, I got given that by Fight King. Really good. But then it's the stuff that also that's kind of like a genre mix. I like it when it's got a sci-fi tinge to it. I like it when it's got a horror tinge to it. Catherine Evans' books, always that slow burning horror to them. And you're never quite sure exactly what, I mean, interesting. More of Me has the horror up front in many ways. You kind of, because you read a bit and you go, oh, and then you think, oh, that's a bit Flowers in the Attic, and then you go, what TV tropes calls fridge horror, something that occurs to you when you're putting the milk in the coffee later on. All of a sudden you think like, oh, actually that's really creepy and unpleasant, and it has that. Whereas Beauty Sleep is much more kind of like as a reader, you are going, this is all wrong. Everything that's happening here is wrong, and it's leading up to more wrongness, and you just know that it's going to be wrong. You don't know how, and that's sort of disorientating, and that's kind of the horror side of things. And then there's like some of the action ones, like quite like Brian E. Pierce's stuff, and Orange Boy by Patrice Lawrence is, you could call that a thriller. It has those elements in it, but I kind of like it when it's like sort of more mixed up. Yeah, but I read a lot of historical fiction, and I like it when it has the tension and the excitement in it, because in the end, I'm that little boy who used to watch, Secret Army on a Saturday night. Is like, I want that. thrill, of that situation.
Yeah, definitely. And like in a panel earlier today, actually, Barry Liger was saying about how a thriller can be so many different types of books. It's just very versatile and flexible, because like pretty much any other genre can have thriller elements as well, with the tension, twist, plotting. So yeah, that's one thing that I really love about thrillers, but it's not just like one set type of book. The genre is just, it's so flexible, and there's just so much versatility in it. So yeah, what advice do you have for aspiring writers?
Ooh, you write. If you are a writer, if you are writing, and so write as often as you can, carve out some time and do it, because there is no substitute for experience, for clocking up those hours. The more writing you do, the better you will be down the line. I was never a particular fan of fan fiction, although being a Star Trek fan when there were just like 3 series and 2 films, I read a lot of fan fiction. Some of it was very bad. It is the people who have been writing fan fiction since they were 11 or 12 who are now the brilliant writers in their mid to late 20s. I'm trying to think. Lauren James and others who I know who are unfeasibly talented in their youth, because they've been writing for a decade or more. So write, and if you can't write, you have to read. You have to read anyway. Learn your craft as much as possible. And I have my own issues with reading growing up and how that was handled. Comics and there are people with learning disabilities, and people who are dyslexic, and people who find concentrating very hard. Audiobooks are reading, comics are reading, graphic novels are reading, reading stuff out, reading. I mean, having a 5-year-old, I've read a lot of picture books over the last 3-4 years, and it's incredibly good for the craft, because when people are writing picture books, they have like 200 words to tell an entire story and make an emotional connection and make it real and probably make it rhyme. That's great. So if you find reading difficult, work around it the best you can. Get what help you can get, and I know it's flimsy enough, but find a way, a system with which you can overcome your issues. And if you can't write, or you can't read, think. Spend some time. I always say, over a certain age, get a dog. The exercise is mandated. You have to go out and you have to spend some time in your own head. That's good thinking time. Give yourself time to think, because especially in this day and age, we all have the phone in front of us, and if we're sitting for even a second, I find myself on Twitter and reading stuff and not spending enough time processing, and that's very important. I do say go with what, as I said earlier, go with what's interesting to you. So follow that, go down that rabbit hole. Even if it just seems ridiculous, feed your brain what it is interested in. And if you can't think, then play. And that isn't being on the on social media. Playing is going off and interacting with something in a creative way. I love Lego. I used to work for Lego, and so I have an awful lot of Lego. And I'm a terrible musician, and I like video games, and so to spend some time in another space, and spend some time playing. Give your brain a rest. If you are in the habit of being creative with your brain, of giving it some space, it will get itself together and give you some ideas. So write, read, think, play.
That's really good advice.
And then join.
That's really good advice.
Yeah, if you want to be a children's writer, join Scooby. you know, and I did an MA, which was incredibly important to me. That's one way of doing it. But like, find your own personal MA, find the thing that makes you do what you need to do. Yeah, that would be my advice.
Okay, great. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about before we wrap up this interview?
Not really.
Okay.
As I said earlier, I'm very, very bad at when, you know, the job interview and they go, so do you have any questions for us? And I go, no, I have nothing. And then I know that I've screwed it up. You know, where's the coffee machine? I do have, this is especially for you because I know that you were asking about it.
Oh, yes.
You know, the last couple of months I have been an appallingly bad homeschool teacher. So you asked, I did say I was dressed as a dinosaur when you were speaking to me. So this is what I was doing.
That does look pretty cool.
Yeah, I have a tail as well, but I haven't got that on because you can't see it.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us for YA Thrillercon. It's been really insightful.
No, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Cool.